Now, let's look at the detail of GDP from the perspective of expenditure. If you may recall from what you learned in principal economics, we learned something called national income account identity. Sometimes it is called the income expenditure identity. We say the Y equals the C plus I plus G plus NX. The Y is the GDP, that is the output. The C is consumption. The I is investment. The G is government expenditure. NX is net exports, which is exports minus import. So now we want to look at the detail of each component. The first component is called consumption. In statistics, it is called the private consumption. It is the consumption by the private sector. The definition of consumption is the value of goods and services bought by households. You can claim it as the spending by domestic households on final goods and services. In US, this number is about 2/3 of GDP. In Taiwan, the number is about 60% of the GDP. Of course, this number may change over time. For this particular component of GDP, we can look into it and see what's inside the consumption. We say there are 3 types of consumption. The first type is the durable goods. The second type is the non-durable goods. The last type is the services. For the first type, the durable goods, we define it as the goods that last for a long time. This can be the goods that purchased by household that will use for many years. For example, the home appliances, the stove, the microwave, the vacuum cleaner, the air conditioner, all of them count as the durable goods. The second type is called the non-durable goods. From the name of it, you already know it is the goods that is not durable, so it's a good that lasts only for a short time. In here, we claim that the goods such as clothing or food are non-durable goods. Some of you may say that, well, for clothing, that we may wear it for many years, it can be an investment, but in here, from the perspective of economics, we assume that the clothing, because it's related to fashion, so it will last only for a short time. So remember that clothing count as non-durable goods. It is not durable goods. Finally, the last type of consumption is the services. Services are work done for the consumers, and for the services, it's not something that is touchable, but you can feel it. You may see that the outcome looks different before and after the services, and that includes dry cleaning, haircut, and they are all services. Now let's move on to look at the second component of the national income account identity, which is investment. So the investment under the government statistics, it's called gross fixed capital formation. If the category includes the changes in the inventory, which later on we will explain why changes in the inventory can also be included in the investment, it is called the gross capital formation. There are 2 definitions for investment. So you can think about there are 2 concepts for investment. The first concept is about the spendings on the new capitals. The second concept of investment is about the goods that is bought for future uses. So you can think about investment in these 2 ways. So for US, the investment to GDP ratio is fluctuating around 15%. For Taiwan, it's roughly above 20% in recent years. So now let's move on to look at the detail of the investment. There are 3 types of investments. One is the business fixed investment, which include the spending of the firms that will be used to produce other goods and services. So it can be machines, it can be equipment, which include the transportation equipment and others. And it also can include the software or the intellectual property products, for example, the R&D and the patents that you purchased. So that's about the business fixed investment. The second type of the investment is the residential fixed investment. So this one is in contrast to the investment that is for producing the other goods and services, but it is for the spending on housing units. Finally, the inventory investment. It is about the changes in the value of all firms' inventories. So why we want to count the changes of the inventories into investment? Recall that the definition of the GDP is the market value of the final goods and services produced within the country's border during some specific period of time. So let's think about, we are looking at the GDP this year. The inventory are goods that is produced and then stored in the warehouse of the firms. Those inventories in stock can be goods that produced last year, the year before last year, or even earlier. So then we cannot count the total inventory as investment because it is not necessarily the goods that is produced in the year that we are interested in for computing the GDP. So now we know we cannot look at the total inventories. But then why we want to look at the changes of the inventory? Because think about the case that if the inventories that is in warehouse produced last year is not at all sold, but in this year you produce more goods and you have more inventories that is not sold and stored in the warehouse. In that case, your inventory will increase, and that increase is for sure the goods that is produced this year. Therefore, we count the changes in the value of inventories as the investment for computing the GDP. But then why we need to include the changes in the inventory as investment? That is because the goods that is produced and stored as an inventory still have some market value, even though it is not yet sold to the final user directly. But it is stored in the warehouse of the firm, and then the firm can use that for sale for the year after. So then you can think about it as an investment for the firms to keep those inventories such that when they want to sell the goods, they can sell it immediately. You don't need to order it and then they put it in the production line and then produce it. The wait time for goods will be shorter when there is inventory. Therefore, it can be the investment for sales department. That is why we want to include inventory in the statistic as investment. A comment on the investment is that sometimes it will be slightly mixed with the durable goods for consumption. That is because, for example, for cars, if household buys a car, then it counts as the consumption durable goods. That is because when the household buys the car, they can use it for a long time. However, now if it is the firm that buys a car, and they use the car to help them transport the goods that they produce, it's because when they have the car, they can provide the services. For example, as a taxi, providing the transportation services. Under that case, the cars will be classified as investment instead of the consumption.
That is because
they use the car to help them transport the goods that they produce. Then it is the spending of the firms that will be used to produce the other goods and services. So obviously, even though it is the same type of goods, it may be classified differently if it is used by different agents. Now, let's move on to look at the next component of the GDP from the perspective of expenditure, that is the government expenditure. The government expenditure under statistic is called the government final consumption and expenditure. And the definition for government expenditure is all the government spending on goods and services but exclude transfer payments. So when we look into the detail of the government expenditure, we know there are several types. One is that the government spending on current needs, which include the salary payment to the government employees. For that spending, it is counted as government expenditure. The second type is the government spending on capital types of assets. For example, when the government builds the airports, the highways, the bridges, they also count as the government expenditure. In addition to these two types of spending, there are at least two types of the spending the government made or not included in the government expenditure. The first type is the transfer payment. That is when the government pays the unemployment benefits or the government pays the subsidies, even though it's the payment or the spending of the government, but it doesn't count as the government expenditure. That is because when the government provides the unemployment benefits, the payment is paid directly to the household, or you can think about it as the final user of the economy. Then the household will use that payment to buy goods. Therefore, if we count the government transfer as the government expenditure, then we will double count it. So let me give you an example to elaborate this idea. So imagine that the government pays you $100, and then you will take this $100 and spend it. Therefore, if this transfer counted as the government expenditure, then we will add the $100 into the GDP because the government spent $100 for it. However, once you receive this $100, you are going to spend it. You are going to buy, for example, breads. Then, when we are computing the GDP for the particular component that is consumption, then because that is the spending of the final users, so we are going to include that in the GDP as well, because that's how much you spent for buying goods, that is $100 bread. Therefore, if we include the transfer into the computation of the government expenditure, then at the end we are going to have $200 in the GDP because you spend $100 to buy the bread, that's your consumption, that is C equals 100. And then the government has the transfer of $100, then it adds up to be 200. So if we include the transfer payment as part of the government expenditure, the more the government pay the transfer, the higher that will be the GDP. But then that doesn't make sense because when the government provides the transfer or gives the transfer, it is as if you have, for example, $1,000 in your left side of the pocket. When the government gives you the $1,000, then it is as if you take your money from the left side of your pocket to the right side of your pocket. As a nation as a whole, that is as if it is as an individual as a whole, when you take the money from the left side of the pocket to the right side of the pocket, in fact, it will not affect the total money in hand. It remains the same. So the government spending on the transfer cannot count as the government expenditure because if you count it, it will result in double counting. So transfer is a type of government spending that doesn't count as government expenditure. The last possible payment for the government is the government's payment for the debt interest. For that payment, we do not count it as the government expenditure as well because it is a payment to the factory production of the household. Therefore, it doesn't count as the government expenditure because at the end, once they receive the interest, they are going to spend it. If you include the debt payment or the government's payment for debt, especially the interest, as the government spending, again, it will also result in double counting. So in here, you need to know that we do not count all the government spending as the government expenditure. the government spending on current need and capital type of the goods are counted as government expenditure. Other than that, the transfer payment and the payment for debt, especially the interest payment, does not count as the government expenditure. So now let's move on to the next component of GDP, which is the net exports. So the net export is the export minus the import. Under the statistics, exports are exports of goods and services, and imports are the imports of goods and services. So the reason why we want to look at the net export as the GDP instead of the export and import together is because the export are the goods that is produced domestically but consumed by people residing outside of the country border. On the other hand, the imports are the goods that is produced outside of the country border, but it is consumed by the people reside domestically. Given that for GDP is the final goods and services produced within the country's border, or the goods that is produced but consumed by the people residing outside of the country border are still the goods that is produced within the country border. Therefore, the GDP need to include the exports. However, for imports, there are goods that is produced outside the country border but consumed inside the country border. So obviously, it is not the goods that is produced inside the country border. So when we want to compute the GDP, we need to exclude that. Therefore, when we are computing the GDP from the expenditure concept, we adding in the consumption, the investment, the government expenditure, and we adding the net exports. Then net export equal to exports minus the imports. So I want to end this topic by looking at the statistic of the consumption to GDP ratio, the investment to GDP ratio, the government expenditure to GDP ratio, and the export, import, and net export to GDP ratio for Taiwan and US. So in this graph, it shows the consumption to GDP ratio for Taiwan and the US. As you can see from here, in the early 1950s to the 60s, the consumption to GDP ratio is really high, that it can be as high as 75%. But then it continued to fall, and then it fluctuates around the 50%. For US, the consumption to output ratio or to GDP ratio stays roughly around 60% in the 1950s to the 70s and gradually increase to the level around slightly below the 70%. So in here, I think the pattern for Taiwan is quite interesting. That is, in the earlier periods when Taiwan is still less developed, the consumption to output ratio is somehow really high. That could be the case that by then the income remained low, so then when people has the income, they spend most of them. However, as the income level rises, people start to have the ability to save because now they have some extra incomes. They can decide whether or not they want to use it or not to use it. So then in Taiwan, it turned out that people prefer to save more than the people residing in US. So that is the consumption to GDP ratio for Taiwan and US. How about the investment to GDP ratio? It turned out that the investment to GDP ratio in Taiwan is much higher than the investment to GDP ratio in the US. In US, it's fluctuating between 15% to 20%. For Taiwan, that as earlier period that the consumption ratio is high, so the investment to GDP ratio turned out to be low, but then it gradually increased from the 1950s to the late 1970s. But then even though there shows some pattern of the fall, then it fluctuates around the 25% in the 1980s to the 1990s and to the early 2000s. Of course, that in more recent years that the investment to GDP ratio turned out to be at a relatively low level compared with the 70s, 80s, and 90s and 2000s. So then how about the government expenditure to GDP ratio? So it turned out that the US government expenditure to GDP ratio is much higher than the government expenditure to GDP ratio in Taiwan. In US it's about 20%, but in Taiwan it is only about 15%. So then this graph shows the exports to GDP ratio. As you can see that the Taiwan's export GDP ratio has been rising since the 1950s. For US, it stayed relatively low since the 1950s and up to nowadays. As you can see in here that the US exports has small percentage of their output to foreign countries, but in Taiwan, we export quite a lot of the goods that is produced domestically to foreign countries. Interestingly, Taiwan also have a lot of imports. The import to GDP ratio in Taiwan is about 15% in the early 1950s, but it rise to 50 to 60% in the 2000s. So these two graphs tell us that the exports and imports amount is quite high in Taiwan, which implies that Taiwan is an open economy. On the contrary, for the US, the imports and exports to GDP ratio is relatively low. Therefore, a lot of time when we are doing macro analysis, we assume that US is a closed economy for simplification. So then how about the net exports? It turned out that Taiwan has a positive net exports since the early 1970s, even though there are some negative in the mid of the 1970s, but overall since the 1970s, the net exports to GDP ratio is a positive number and it has been increasing. For US, this number is interesting that it was about zero net exports in the earlier period, but nowadays they have more imports than exports. So I provide these statistics to wrap up our discussion related to the components of GDP from the expenditures perspective.